that being a Jew in much of Eastern Europe was a dangerous thing. And it was a sense of that push that brought many of them to Israel. But why Israel? Well, those who came to Israel often came because of pull factors, because of the simple reality that religiously Israel was seen to be the homeland, was the homeland, because there was a sense that if they came, they might actually be able to reestablish Israel as a Jewish homeland. That's all beginning in this period, the first Aliyah. The second Aliyah occurs between 1904 and 1917, and that's primarily Eastern European Jews. And by 1914, that 25,000 had grown to 85,000. 85,000 Jews now living in Israel, or what was then Palestine, and half of them at that point in time are living in Jerusalem. And if you look at map number 1, you can see those settlements and how things looked at that period of time. So again, motivations for the migration included religious reasons, among other things, a desire to be able to study, especially in Jerusalem, to escape pogroms. And everybody knows what a pogrom is? No? Okay. P-O-G-R-O-M-A-M-S. A pogrom is an organized governmental purge. Purge is one word that could be used. Attack is another word. It's governmental terrorism. It's state-sponsored terrorism is what it is. The state says, we don't want you here, and we're going to make it awful difficult for you to stay. So pogroms. Again, another motivation to escape economic and political conditions, and Zionism. And I want to spend some time on Zionism in a few minutes. There also were some folks coming from Western Europe where there had been some assimilation of Jews into the Western European nations, but there was rising anti-Semitism in Western Europe in this period of time. So let's talk about Zionism. Zionism, the objective of Zionism is to establish a Jewish homeland. At that time, the objective was to establish a Jewish homeland in cooperation with the great powers of the world, which included at that time Great Britain, France, the United States, others. And initially, Zionism was all about creating a secular state, a secular state. Many Jewish writers of the late 19th century were very impressed with the rise of nation states. We often forget, historically, that the way the world is organized today in the 214 or whatever the current number is of nation states, that's new. We forget that that's a 19th century phenomenon. The whole idea of independent nation states is a 19th century phenomenon. It's confusing because we often talk about, for instance, we've heard in the news this week a lot about France and how 800 years ago Notre Dame was built, and that has been an icon for France ever since. But France as a nation state is much, much newer than that. It's a political description, a nation state. So many of the writers are impressed with the rise of nation states. In 1862, for instance, Moses Hess suggests the establishment of a nation state and a homeland for Jews in Palestine. But on the other hand, others were saying, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be in Palestine. Leo Pinsker in 1881 suggests It's important to find a homeland, to create a nation state for the Jews, but it could be wherever we can find a place. You may not know that there was a movement at one point in time within the Zionist movement to establish such a state in Australia, of all places. There were African locations that were considered. There were many locations that were considered in addition to Palestine. Those who were a part of the Zionist movement, who were known as Hebat Zion, which means lovers of Zion, were especially devoted to Hebrew education and national revival. And this is the group that works to help establish Jewish agricultural settlements in Palestine. And that ultimately becomes a very important part of the story. In 1896, Theodor Herzl, one of those world leader names that whether you're a Jew or not, you should know, Theodor Herzl. He's the founder of political Zionism, and he wrote about der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, in his writings. And he writes at one point, Palestine is our ever memorable historic home. The very name of Palestine would attract our people. By our people, he's referring to Jews around the world. In 1897, in Basel, in Switzerland, the first World Zionist Congress is held, 1897. And out of that Congress comes the Basel Program, which was adopted by that gathering of those who were working towards a Zionist end. In August of that year, the Basel Program was adopted, and I just want to read you, it's a very short thing, I want to read it to you. The aim of Zionism is to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law. The World Zionist Congress contemplates the following means to the attainment of this end. 1, the promotion on suitable lines of the colonization of Palestine by Jewish agricultural and industrial workers. So this was to be a movement of the people, the common people, not the elites. I don't like that phrase at all because I guess technically because of my education I'm among the elites and I hate that term. But this was designed, intended to be for all the people, for the common people, agricultural, industrial workers, among others. 2, the organization and binding together of the whole of Jewry by means of appropriate institutions, local and international, in accordance with the laws of each country. So this wasn't simply about creating the Zionist state, creating what is today Israel. It was also about bringing together Jews from around the world in a common cause. And I don't know, Steve, you'll probably comment on this, but it seems to me that that end has been met in many ways, that Israel serves as a common bond for Jews around the world. Fair? Fair? No question, Steve's saying. 3, the strengthening and fostering of Jewish national sentiment and consciousness. Raising awareness, raising a sense of this is important, this is something we want to do. And 4, preparatory steps towards obtaining government consent, where necessary, to the attainment of the aim of Zionism. In other words, this was to be played out in the, if you will, the international arena. And let's do this in such a way that other nation states can sign on board and say, yes, this is a good thing, yes, this needs to happen, yes, we want it to happen. It's, of course, point number 4, where there is arguably the greatest amount of work that lies ahead, and also the greatest amount of difficulty. So that's the Basel Program, adopted by the First World Zionist Congress in 1897. Now, it's important to note here at this point that at the turn of the century, not the last turn of the century, but the turn of the century before that, turn of the 20th century, the Zionist movement was not welcomed in all Jewish communities. So, let me ask you if you have any idea why maybe that was the case. And let's start with just the Christians in the room. I'm going to make the assumption that some of the Bat Yam folk can answer that question easily. Anybody have any idea why some Jewish communities would not have been real happy about this? Yes?
Fear that they won't be accepted by their host country and their fellow citizens.
Okay, well that certainly is a factor, I am sure, but not the main factor. Yeah, Barbara.
Could it raise anger in their communities?
I think you're saying essentially the same thing.
You know, like I'm living comfortably in my community and this becomes an international issue and then the people...
So that kind of blowback from it. Yeah, I mean, that's an issue. But there's another subtler, in some ways, subtler issue. Now, Bat Yammers, you're in on the answer too, Alan.
Assimilation.
Assimilation. Okay, say something about that.
Well, the fear was if they would give up their local or their national feelings, Germany, for example, Italy, certainly in the United States, they would lose their stature within or identity within those countries if they had a dual concept.
Okay, all right. Again, that's a variation on what was already said, but I agree with that. Any other thoughts?
They thought they were safer by assimilating.
Okay, so let's pause here because assimilation's been mentioned twice. Of course, assimilation is how do you fit into the society in which you live?
Correct.
It's a huge issue today, right now, right this very minute in this country. It's a huge issue, assimilation. Not so much for Jews, although perhaps continues to be to some extent there, but it's a major question. How do we assimilate people? How do we bring them into our society, our culture, and how do they do that work themselves? But here, look, this is what I'm fishing for, and nobody's taking the bait. There were also very Orthodox Jews who said, no, wait a minute. We can't return to the Holy Land until the Messiah comes.
Oh, wow.
No Messiah, no Holy Land was sort of their battle cry. And here's the really interesting piece of that. I did some work in my PhD studies looking at fundamentalist Christians in the 30s and 40s and asking the question, my thesis was that despite what appears to be very strongly supportive words about the formation of Israel, that underlying it was anti-Zionism, and it was. I mean, my research would demonstrate that it was. And there were fundamentalist Christians who were very opposed to the creation of the modern state of Israel because it was being pushed and led by Zionists. And that was contrary to their notion that until the second coming of the Messiah, there should be no Jews in the Holy Land. So it's a very interesting parallel sort of reason why. Anyway, maybe that's only interesting to me. But I hope not. Because I want you to take careful note of some of the support for Israel that is generated in this country that really isn't so much about supporting Jews in Israel as it is understood to be a stepping stone towards the second coming. So that's another issue for another day. And so, at any rate, but among Jews themselves, there were those Jews, very Orthodox Jews, who were opposed to that, to the Zionist movement, because they saw it as a change of focus from devotional, religious, ritual reasons and purposes to that which was political. Herzl dies in 1904, but the movement that he was so instrumental in continues to grow, and the population grows rather slowly, but continues to grow in Palestine. And as I've said, by 1914 there were 85,000 Jews in Palestine, and it's estimated that there were about 500,000 Arabs living throughout Palestine. And meanwhile, external powers are vying for control of the area. Now, the basic problem boiled down to this, and this is an oversimplification, but hopefully it will help you grasp what's going on. Both Zionists and Arabs, under the leadership of Sharif Hussein ibn Ali, who was the emir of Mecca, of course in Saudi Arabia, were seeking to control Palestine and, in fact, the whole region. The British had encouraged revolt by the Arabs against the Ottomans. You'll remember our story last week ended with the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire comes apart in 1914. So the British encouraged the Arabs to revolt against the Ottomans. And in exchange, the British pledged support for Sharif and his desires to control Palestine. The vagueness around what they said wasn't really resolved for quite some time. However, at one and the same time, the British welcomed Jewish fighters to come and join the fight. And the Jewish fighters weren't motivated to get Sharif in power. They were motivated by the Zionist desire to create a nation state, to create a homeland, or to claim a homeland. Chaim Weizmann leads the Zionists in that effort, and all of that finally leads to what you've more than likely heard of if you remember your high school world history civics class, the Balfour Declaration, named for Arthur James Balfour, the British lord who was responsible for it. The Balfour Declaration is issued in November of 1917, and this is the Balfour Declaration. Again, it's short. Let me read it to you. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure to convey to you on behalf of His Majesty's government, the British government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in other countries. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Now, you'll notice there's some things missing in the Balfour Declaration which lead to all sorts of problems over the next decades. First of all, there's no timetable. So when is this supposed to happen? How is this supposed to happen? No timetable. And there's also in the Balfour Declaration, there are these assurances that the Arabs already living there will be able to continue to live there, and that their rights won't be abridged, and that there's support for the creation of this homeland. But there's no real clear end result stated in the Balfour Declaration. I mean, what I read you is actually more than the declaration itself. I read you the whole letter in which that declaration is passed on. It is one paragraph for this enormously complex undertaking. And look, here we've got the basic problem. at one and the same time, the British have thrown their support behind the Arabs, and the British have thrown their support behind the Jews. They've officially done that in both directions without clearly articulating, okay, this is for instance, a two-state solution or something like that. There's no clear anything, and it creates all sorts of problems. You remember last time I said to you the story often of this region is Western intervention messing everything up? Here you go again. And these Westerners speak English just like most of us do. 1917, Allenby takes Jerusalem from the Turks, and he is supported in doing that, Allenby, the British general, with thousands of Jewish troops working with him in that effort. In 1918, there is an armistice signed, and Palestine comes under British control at that time. In 1919, the Zionist Federation makes a proposal how this should look. And if you look at map number two, you'll see what that proposal was. You know what? I gave away all of my maps. I need one. Can I steal one from you guys? All right, so you'll see this is the Zionist plan for 1919. And you'll see as you look at this that it looks awfully familiar. It's not exactly the way things are laid out today, but very familiar. Okay. So in 1920, conference is held at San Remo, and the Palestine Mandate, or the British Mandate, it's called both, is established and approved by the League of Nations. Now, tell me something important about the League of Nations.
No U.S.
Right, no U.S. We were not ever part of the League of Nations, despite Woodrow Wilson's best efforts. And so, sort of right from the gate, the League, as wonderful an idea as it was an impotent organization. So despite the fact that it has League of Nations approval, that's not going to help a whole lot. If you look at map number 3, you will see the so-called Palestine Mandate granted to Great Britain by the League of Nations. And a small section is ceded to Great Britain, ceded by Great Britain to the French Mandate of Syria in 1923. And that section has very much been in the news lately, the Golan Heights. Okay? So you can see this is a much, much bigger territory than modern-day Israel or than the Zionist plan for Palestine. So the mandate, one, recognizes the historical, one of the things the mandate did and said was it recognized the historical connection between Jews and the Holy Land. It recognizes that. It says, yes, there is a connection here. It's a real connection, a legitimate connection. 2, it recognized the World Zionist Organization, or the Jewish Agency, recognized it as a legitimate body negotiating, if you will, on behalf of Jews. And it established 3 official languages for this territory: English, Hebrew, and Arabic. So that's all in the British Mandate. The objective was also stated in the Mandate, and that was for the peaceful coexistence of Arabs and Jews. That was the stated objective, the peaceful coexistence of Arabs and Jews. Between 1919 and, so just before the Mandate, through 1923, but I mean, the significance of those dates are in part after World War I, 35,000 Jews move to Palestine. This is called the Third Aliyah. they were many of them, maybe even most of them, were well-trained socialist Zionists. And this is when the strong movement towards collective farming, the establishment of kibbutz, the kibbutzim as they were known, those who lived on kibbutzes. Those of us who are traveling to Israel will have the chance to see a kibbutz, visit a kibbutz. It's much less important today than it was then, but was an important part of the establishment of modern Israel. Arabs and Jews were each to be self-governing under the mandate. There was the creation of governmental agencies, including Haganah, the defense, the Israeli Defense Forces. And the major leader in this period of time is another person whose name you probably know, David Ben-Gurion. Very important figure in this period of time. But none of this went easily. There were major struggles over this between the Arabs and the Jews, and the British didn't always do a real good job, in fact, often did a very poor job of mediating things. Between 1924 and 1932, 60,000 Jews move into the region. Primarily, in this period of time, these are Polish immigrants. And they settle in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, and again in Jerusalem. So I hope one of the things you're realizing as you're hearing all of this is the very international sort of flavor of things, or at least international in terms of coming from various parts of Europe, from Russia, and so forth. In the 1930s, after the rise of Hitler, the folks coming to Israel are mostly German, and many of them are professionals. So notice there's a distinction here. Those earlier settlers are many of them among those industrial and agricultural workers that were called for in the original proposal. But now many professionals are coming. And here, of course, we're seeing both push and pull, but I would suggest at this point in time, the bigger factor is the push factor. These are folks who are leaving Germany and other places, but primarily coming from Germany because living in Germany was clearly becoming more and more difficult, if not impossible, for Jews. And note, though, why do you think so many of these folks were professionals as opposed to, say, agricultural workers or industrial workers? Background, yep.
From big cities.
Coming from big cities, yep. Yeah.
Well, all their assets were seized by the German government.
Yeah. Barry?
Well, Germany had a good education system.
Mm-hmm. Yep, it did. Well, in part, the professionals are coming in part because they had the connections. Many of them had international connections that allowed them to move more freely than, say, the guy who's, stamping out die parts in some factory. So there's that, and just more wherewithal in a variety of ways. In the 30s, about 165,000 Jews, again, primarily from Germany, come to Israel. Backing up a moment, between 1928 and 1929, there are major riots at the Wailing Wall, and there is a massacre in Hebron at the hand of the Arabs. In 1935, the Arabs in Palestine petitioned the British to halt land transfers and to end immigration. So in 1935, the Arabs petitioned the British and say, look, let's stop giving any land to Jews, that's the bottom line here, and let's end any immigration. That proposal from the Arabs is rejected by the British. In 1936, the Arabs engage in a general strike, a strike across the country. And there is escalating violence. And while that strike, pieces of it go on for 3 years, it's intense for the first 6 months. In 1937, Lord William Peel issued the so-called Peel Report. And he had been in charge of a British Royal Commission of Inquiry to look into the situation. And much of this is prompted by those riots. Okay, things aren't going well in Palestine, the British finally figured out. So somebody needs to go in there and look it over and figure out what's going on. And the bottom line is Peel ends up saying the mandate is unworkable. It isn't going to cut it. And he recommends partitioning, dividing up the territory between the Arabs and the Jews. And he notes that there are what he called irreconcilable expectations and conflicts. And so he suggests dividing things up into 3 zones. And if you look at map 4, you'll see the Peel Commission plan's recommendation for what was called cantonization. Cantonization. So the Jewish state is in the gray, if you will. The Arab state with the horizontal lines, and then the Jerusalem enclave, mandated territory, with the diagonal slashes. Again, both Arabs and Zionists object. Neither group likes the Peel Commission plan. And the League of Nations objects. The Jewish Agency accepts the plan, though they're very unhappy about what's being proposed for Jerusalem. The Arabs just out and out reject the plan. There are further discussions. In May of 1939, the British government issues what came to be called the White Paper. It proposed greatly restricting Jewish immigration, suggesting that immigration be restricted to 75,000 people over a 5-year period of time. It also, the British White Paper also suggested creating an independent state in the Mandate area that would be neither Jewish nor Arab, and that it should be established within 10 years. So there is that very concrete set of proposals. And then, of course, everybody gets preoccupied with World War II. And really, the next major piece here is though there's certainly many things that go on in between, is May 15th in 1948, when the British Mandate ends. And at this point, the United Nations is in formation. There is the Israeli War of Independence. There is an invasion by armies from Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. But finally, on May 15th of 1948, the Soviet Union and the United States both recognize Israel. And then obviously there's a whole story about the War of Independence that we're not going into for time's sake. In January of 49, the election of the first Knesset, and I know Steve's going to talk a little bit more about that. And over the course of 49, various armistices are signed with Egypt, with Lebanon, with Jordan, with Syria. In May of 1949, Israel joins the UN. And your last map, map number 5, shows you how things were proposed in 47, leading up to that. So a complicated story, far more complicated than the 40 minutes that I just took to tell it. A story full of push and pull. And again, a story where I know I'm emphasizing this, but that's on purpose, where a whole lot of outside interference is misguided, poorly handled, and just not done in a good, solid way. Steve.
First of all, I want to thank John for a presentation worthy of any professional historian, fair, accurate, and I think very, very important. There's an imbalance, as John pointed out at the outset last week. He views this situation as an interested Christian minister and a professional historian, but without the passion, without the kishka connection, if you will, that I fully acknowledge I bring to the whole discussion. Israel is part of my DNA. John mentioned the resistance of the religious sections of the Jewish people correctly, because the Messiah hadn't come. I am proud to say that in 1862, in a publication known as Drishat Zion, Seeking Zion, my great-great-grandfather, Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, was among the very first Orthodox rabbis. He would totally consider what I do today blasphemy to support the political movement to return to Palestine. There is a kibbutz named for him in the Afula area, and I think that this is something significant because he did so. His argument was an argument that I put forward all the time. Again, even though he would oppose everything I do, a covenantal argument. We've talked about this in other classes. All of Jewish thought is underlain by the idea of a brit, a covenant, an agreement between us and God. And for Kalischer, he said to his Orthodox co-religionists, don't wait for God to do it all. It's a partnership, just like God made with Abraham. Now, I'm going to do something a little bit unusual because, for me, I'm going to read to you from a presentation I prepared for an institute for non-Jewish clergy a few years ago in Connecticut about Israel, and I want to do that for two reasons. Number one, I want to be sure there's no misunderstanding of what I said. It's going to be in writing. I'll be able to say, no, this is what I said in case anybody misunderstands. And two, honestly, I could speak about this for a good hour and a half. You don't have that much time. I don't have that much time. So I want to make sure that I say certain things that are important. Then I want to talk a little bit about the recent election, which is, I think, very important for us going to Israel. But everything I say in support of Israel is rejected by the overwhelming majority of the Arab world. The end of the mandate and the vote by the United Nations on November 29th, 1947, to partition Palestine. The British basically said, we can't do this anymore. We're leaving. No solution, we're leaving. And the UN came in and said, okay, 2 states for 2 people. Great, said the Jewish world. Our dreams are coming true. No way, said the Arab world. we will drive you into the sea. And I submit that that is still the overwhelming position of the Arab world today. Yes, there are voices that want to make peace. But no, they have not been able to gain the influence in the Arab world to allow them to do so. In the meantime, understandably, Jewish positions have hardened. But we have to understand and listen with empathy to the Arab narrative, because what for Jews was the culmination, almost the redemptive moment in Jewish history, when the United Nations voted that there will be a Jewish state after 2,000 years, is considered in the Arab world the Nakba, the catastrophe that has led to all of their difficulties since then. One other point. In 1987, I was asked to address a conference on Zionism as part of the Jewish-Christian dialogue in Baltimore. And I vividly remember that one of the people listening to me, and I was quite intimidated by that, was Rabbi Murray Saltzman. A name that was very, very important in the history of Sanibel. And at that conference, which was in 1987, so if some of you have heard this story since then, I understand. I told of the time when the chief rabbi of Israel, the Pope of Rome, and the Archbishop of Canterbury all died on the same day. And they were all escorted into an elevator to take them to their eternal home. And they all got in, each thinking in his own way that he merited great reward. To their chagrin, the elevator began to descend. And after a long journey down, the doors opened, and the elevator operator turned to the Pope and said, "Your Holiness, you exit here." There was a scene of fire and brimstone. The Pope said, "There must be some mistake." "No mistake, out." So out he went. The rabbi and the Archbishop of Canterbury looked at each other, but their smugness soon turned in the other direction when the elevator began to descend further. And after another long journey, it stopped. And the fire and brimstone was even worse than before. And the operator said, "Archbishop of Canterbury, this is your stop."
Wow.
"Can't be." "Yes, it is." Out. Out he goes. Doors close. The elevator then continues down, 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 and down even further. And finally the doors open, and there is a pastoral scene of green grass, babbling brooks, abundant crops. The elevator operator looks at the rabbi, looks at his sheep, looks back at the rabbi and says, "You Israelis and your damn irrigation." Now, aside from being a nice story, it really makes an important point. Because what Israel has done with the land is an important part of the Israeli narrative of the legitimacy of Israel. To the Arab world, what Israel has done with the land could not be less significant. Doesn't matter. It was our land, you took it. So again, we have the basic problem, which I articulated at the very beginning of my presentation last week. Two peoples, one piece of real estate, prescription for conflict. But Mark Twain, the great American writer, toward the end of the 19th century, undertook a visit to the Holy Land, to Palestine. And when he got there, as he wrote, he said, the great land of the Bible turned out to be a land of sand and stones. The stones were there to keep the sand from blowing away. When you see Israel in a few weeks, you won't see a land of sand and stones. You will see one of the most modern countries in the world, and that's a source of great pride. But it is also part of the conflict. With that, for several hundred years, until the end of World War I, the vast land area of the Middle East was under the control, as John said, of the Ottoman Turks. Since the end of World War I, no fewer than 22 Islamic nations have established themselves. 22 Arab peoples carved out of that erstwhile vast Turkish empire have realized their hopes for nationhood, sovereignty, and recognition from the world community. Jews also lived in the Ottoman Empire. Why does the world begrudge us one tiny sliver of land to which we have been connected, as I pointed out last week, from the very beginning of our historical narrative, to realize our national aspirations as well, when 22 Islamic nations have realized the same dream? After the Holocaust, the world realized that had there been an Israel to which Jews could flee, Hitler never would have destroyed 2/3 of European Jewry, 2 out of every 3. And when you compare the figures, the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust, with the figures John quoted of the British White Paper of 1939, which, to refresh your memory, was to limit the total future immigration of Jews to Palestine in the next 5 years to a grand total of 75,000. 15,000 a year. Any more, only with the permission of the Arab authorities, which meant no more. When you compare those numbers to the fact that 1/3 of all the Jews in the world died in the Holocaust, 2/3, as I said, of Europe's leaders, of European Jews, 3/4 of Jewish leaders, rabbis, cantors, teachers, educators. When you compare those numbers totaling 6 million to the gracious allowance of 75,000, I hope you understand why the Jewish world resisted that white paper with every fiber of strength that it could muster. And so, as I said, the United Nations voted to partition the land into 2 states. The British basically turned themselves out. Azam Pasha, Secretary General of the Arab League, responded to the UN declaration, the UN vote, by saying that the rivers would flow with Jewish blood. This will be a war, he exulted, like the Mongolian massacres, like the Crusades, and any betting person would have put odds that he would do it. But somehow, some way, Israel survived. It turned out he was wrong. The Jewish nation, against overwhelming odds, did manage to establish itself, but the Arab dream to wipe her out persisted. For 19 years, the Arab world boycotted Israeli goods and terrorized her borders. in 1967, the Arabs again mobilized for all-out military attack. And they did the following. Number one, they closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. That strait that would allow ships to get to the Israeli southern port of Eilat. A naval blockade by all international law is an act of war. Number two, they ordered the United Nations troops who were in a buffer in the Sinai on the border between what was then Egypt and now again is Egypt because of Israeli concessions, out. And Utant, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who received an honorary degree from my alma mater when I graduated, Hamilton College, took the troops out, ordered the troops out without so much a whimper of protest. So, there lay Israel, again vulnerable to annihilation, ready, as Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, promised for his troops to drive Israel into the sea. As you know, though, that is not what happened, even though the world, the Jewish world, trembled. If you can go back to the 1st of June, 1967, the panic, the fright in the Jewish world that Israel would imminently be destroyed was palpable. But as you know, Israel did launch a preemptive strike in the face of those very specific provocations and acts of war. Israel drove the Egyptian army across the Sinai Desert to the other side of the Suez Canal. In fierce fighting, they drove the Syrian troops off of the Golan Heights, from where for years, and we will see it with our own eyes, Syrian forces looked down on Israel's breadbasket in the Galilee Valley below, and at their leisure would lob bombs and Katyusha rockets, terrorizing all of Israeli agriculture, the food which feeds Israel. And during the early days of that war, when Israel's future was in the balance, when her armies were occupied with Egypt on this side, had already taken care of Lebanon and Syria to the north, the Prime Minister of Israel, Levi Eshkol, issued a stern warning publicly to King Hussein of Jordan. This is very important today because the whole question of the West Bank begins right here. Your Majesty, stay out of this war, the Israeli Prime Minister warned. We have no designs on East Jerusalem or any of the territory your country now occupies. And Hussein had a choice: to heed that warning or to join his Arab brethren in the quest to throw Israel into the sea. And he chose option B and invaded West Jerusalem. I still remember my landlady when I studied in Israel in 1970-71, Mrs. Daniel Auster, widow of the man who was the mayor of Jerusalem at the end of the mandate, widow of the man who was the first mayor of independent Jerusalem. And I'm living in her house, and she says, you cannot imagine our fright when we saw the Jordanian troops coming into West Jerusalem. But somehow, some way, the Israeli troops, it will be a miracle that we will recount in 2,000 years the way we talk about the splitting of the sea at the time of the Exodus. Drove Jordan's troops out of East Jerusalem and across the Jordan River. And that is how the West Bank came to become under Israeli sovereignty.